As we turn on the TV, we see happily married couples like Hallmark, maybe just movies that we watch or TV shows, but is that really married reality? What exactly does it mean for wives to submit to their husbands? Does that mean that my husband is my boss and I have to do what he says? What if sex with my spouse is very, very unfulfilling? What do I do about that? What about if my spouse and I are completely opposite? Like what happens in a marriage when we don't even like to do the same things? Or how about this question? What do I do if my spouse is not interested in even going to church at all or interested in spiritual things? What do we do? Those are some of the questions we're going to be answering today in session 1 of our Marriage Questions Conference, and we will have Dr. Sean McDowell help us answer those questions. Welcome to Mr. Sean McDowell. Sean McDowell. I want to call your dad's name. Sean is a son of Josh McDowell. For those of you that know Josh, he's kind of awesome. He told us one time, you need to know my son because he's really brilliant. And then I got to watching his stuff, and he is really brilliant. So give me your website, Sean McDowell.
.org.
Okay. Sean is an apologist. So when I asked him to do this marriage conference, his first response was, Lisa, I'm not a marriage counselor. And I'm like, well, I get that, but you know the Bible, you have biblical wisdom, and you've been married. And you had a really good, I suppose, role model with your mom and dad.
I did.
Not everyone has that. So you are a professor at Biola.
Yep.
Biola University, which I want to go to Biola now just so I can sit in on your classes. And what Sean does is he's an apologist, which means he wants people to learn how to defend their faith. And he's very, very big into helping our college kids, even high school kids do that. So make sure you check out his website. So, all right, first question this morning, I want Sean just to talk about let's just talk about marriage. Why does marriage even matter to God at all? So have at it.
That's a great question. So honored to be here with you today. I am a professor at Biola, and I also teach one high school class because I love hanging out with students. And recently I decided to probe my students with the very question that you're asking me. I said, biblically speaking, does marriage matter to God? And so let's go on the board and brainstorm together how much marriage shows up in Scripture, and then maybe that can give us an insight to whether marriage matters to God or not. So I said, you tell me, and these again are high school students, juniors and seniors, you tell me where marriage shows up in the Bible. And of course, this took us 20, 30 minutes, but one student raised her hand. She said, doesn't the Bible begin with a marriage? I said, you're right. In Genesis chapter 1, of course, it says God makes them male and female, says multiply, fill the earth. And then in Genesis 2, it fills in the details about how we're supposed to do this. When it says a man shall leave his father and mother, bond to his wife, and the two shall become one. Notice it says wife. It's talking about marriage. So isn't that interesting? That Scripture begins very soon with marriage. So then I pushed back on them and said, hey, okay, where else does marriage show up? Now, they didn't get this one. This is one I gave them. I said, do you know what the longest chapter in the Torah is? The first 5 books in the Bible. And they talked and eventually figured it out. It's actually Genesis chapter 24. It's the longest chapter about how Abraham sends out his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac, who is Rebekah. Isn't that interesting that the longest chapter in the Torah is about marriage? And of course, the chapter ends with them officially getting married. I said, okay, you guys are doing great. Tell me more. Think more about, stay in the Old Testament. Where does marriage show up in the Old Testament? And eventually one student said, doesn't it show up in the 10 Commandments? I said, it does. How so? Now, if you've looked at the 10 Commandments and thought about this, it's interesting that Jesus says he would sum up the commandments with love God and love other people. Well, if you look at the 10 Commandments, the first 4 are about loving God in a sense. They're vertical. right? Have no gods before me, worshiping idols, don't take the Lord's name in vain, and honor the Sabbath. Those are vertical. The next 6 are horizontal between people. Of the commandments given between people, what's the first one? You tell me. This is the participatory part of the program. Honor your father and mother. Isn't that interesting that marriage is built into it? I said, what other commandments seem to have an understanding of marriage? Commandment number 7, which is do not commit adultery, which assumes a certain understanding of marriage. Then commandment number 10, which says what? Do not covet your neighbor's oxen. I think it says first or stuff that my students are like, what's that all about? I said, we'll come back to that. It says, don't covet your neighbor's wife. Isn't that interesting? 3 of the top 10 commandments, 30%, but then 3 of 6 between people assumes a certain understanding and importance of marriage. And so, right, we're on a good track here. Where else does marriage show up? And eventually one student said, I think if you go to the prophets, like Isaiah and some of the other major and minor prophets, don't they compare unfaithfulness to God to a kind of adultery? I said, you're right. So in God's relationship with his chosen people, when he wants us to understand how severe it is that we're unfaithful in terms of, for example, worshiping other gods, he uses the example of adultery. He uses marriage gone wrong as a way of understanding our relationship with God gone wrong. So just in the Old Testament, Bible begins with a marriage. Longest chapter in the Torah is about a marriage. 3 of the 10 commandments assume an understanding of marriage. And you get to the prophets, spiritual adultery is used with our relationship with God. I said, in the Old Testament seems to be important. What about the New? They started thinking about it. They said, well, didn't Jesus talk about marriage? I said he did, and we're going to get into that a lot today. In fact, in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus is asked about divorce. By the way, what does he do? He cites Genesis 1 and he cites Genesis 2 in his response to the permissibility of divorce. You also see this in Mark 10. Jesus used marriage as an illustration. He taught on it. Now, he wasn't married. So I said to these students, I said, we don't want to say marriage relationally is necessarily more important than singleness. That's an important conversation because Paul actually said he'd prefer that people stay single, and Jesus was single. So we can talk about the importance of singleness, but Jesus talked about the importance of marriage. What about Paul? Does Paul talk about marriage? Yeah, you're going to hear a lot of passages today. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Colossians chapter 3, Ephesians chapter 5. Paul teaches on the importance of marriage. So you get to the New Testament, God in human flesh talks about marriage. Paul, who wrote 13 letters in the Bible, talks about marriage. It seems to be a pretty important theme through Scripture. But then one student finally picked up and said, okay, wait a minute. The Bible begins with the wedding, with the marriage. It's all through the Old Testament. Jesus and Paul teach on it. Doesn't the Bible end with a wedding? And this student was right. You see in Revelation 19, you talk about the marriage supper of the Lamb and the bride of Christ. The Bible begins, is flooded through in the middle, and ends with a marriage, with a wedding. This tells me a couple things. Number one, we better get marriage right, biblically speaking. But second, our marriages, your marriage, and my marriage matter to God. They matter to the church, and they matter to the world. In fact, in Ephesians chapter 5, we're going to get into this a little bit in some of our discussion. Paul has this fascinating passage where he, again, like Jesus, quotes Genesis 1 and quotes Genesis 2. And what does he say? He says, this is a mystery, but it's pointing to Christ's love for the church. That's what marriage is about. Now, I think, and I've done this, I'll ask Christian students, adults, even sometimes pastors, what's the purpose of marriage? And the typical answers we get is to have kids and procreate. That is a vital, essential part of marriage, I agree. Second might be companionship. Absolutely built into Adam was alone and had a companion. By the way, it doesn't say lonely, it says alone. Those are very different things. Companionship is a part of marriage. But that's not the heart of the purpose of marriage. The heart of the purpose of marriage is to demonstrate to the world Christ's love for the church. You think about all the relationships that God could have chosen. He could have chosen a mother and a child. I mean, I love my kids endlessly, and I die for my kids, but I see something in my wife, I'm like, yeah, there's just this motherly love that is just profound and deep. I mean, why didn't God use that as the prime metaphor? How about like brothers in war, like where you die for each other and you go through a battle, or business partners, or siblings, or father-son, father-daughter? Those are all powerful relationships. The main relationship God chose is a marriage relationship, which is one man, one woman, one flesh, one lifetime, to model to the world his love for the church. Now, last thing I'll say, and then we'll jump to the questions. Why is this important? I played basketball in college, and the only reason I mention that is because I put my body through a lot of pain because I had an end goal. I wanted to compete, and I wanted to win, and I wanted to be on the team. Because I had a goal bigger than myself, I was willing to suffer running the mile and lifting, getting up early, whatever, trying to compete. When it comes to marriage, we think marriage is about our own companionship, our own needs. Sometimes we don't have a bigger goal in mind, so we're not willing to suffer and work for something bigger than ourselves. So we just wanted to start off today by encouraging you that your marriage matters. I know there's a lot of you here, a lot of you watching this, probably in a lot of pain and feeling like you are hanging on by a thread. I want to encourage you, number one, there is hope. I have seen marriages in the most desperate situation turn things around, because that's at the heart of the gospel, isn't it? But second, your marriage matters. It's bigger than you, and it's bigger than me. It's all over the scriptures, and God has chosen your marriage and my marriage, as humbling as that is, to model to the world his love for the church. So we're glad you're here. We're glad you're watching. Let's get into the nitty-gritty, so to speak, of how we work out some of these tough questions and situations that are on our hearts and minds.
Thank you. Yeah, I sit there and listen to you, and I'm like, that's how marriage should be. But in reality, like, we live in this world where there's just sin, and there's just, and I don't find that a lot going on. And even in the churches, we're struggling with stuff like that. So I think a lot of it comes back to, because we have 7 kids, 6 of them are married. And I think when they all got married, they just assumed that this is going to make my life so happy. Like, I'm supposed to be happy all the time. And so then they get married, and then they start watching TV, like I always say, Hallmark. You said The Notebook one time in your, and you just assume, like, well, they're so compatible, and they never argue. And so I guess the first question is, like, when you're married, should you be happy? I called my daughter the other day. She just got married. And I said to her, I just want to know if you're having fun. And she's like, having fun? Like, we're married. Like, what are you talking about? Like, not that you shouldn't have fun, but I think we get married and we just think it's so, it just becomes really difficult that almost the fun and the happiness goes away. So should you be happy?
Well, I think this is the result of a Disney, Hallmark, notebook worldview that has infested us and the church, I think, more than we probably even realize. Does God want us to be happy? Well, I think we're going to have to define what we mean by happiness. If happiness means feeling good all the time and we root it in a feeling, Yeah, God does care about our feelings. He created us for joy. He wants us to enjoy marriage. Sex as a part of marriage is a gift that he made pleasurable for a reason. We are designed to enjoy marriage. But bigger than that, what's interesting, if you go back to some of the classical Greek worldview, they had something called eudaimonia, and that's happiness. But it didn't just mean how you felt. It was a life of virtue. It was a life committed to something bigger than you that you sacrifice for. And if you did that, regardless of how you felt, you would be considered happy. So don't hear me saying that marriage is grit your teeth, it doesn't matter how you feel, just dutiful. That's not my point. But my point is, I think we've approached this through the lens of evaluating a marriage first through how we feel, rather than first through what does God want for me? How do I love another person? And then what's interesting is so often when we approach marriage that way, we have a deeper sense of contentment and happiness that often comes with it.
Perfect. The second question we're going to talk about is the whole submitting to your husband kind of a thing, because that's kind of a big deal. I am not going to be talking throughout this whole conference. I'm just like, I'm a monitor or whatever it's called. But I am going to talk about this particular question just because I'm a woman, I teach Bible, and women are having to deal with this a lot. So I'm going to tell you how I feel like I've got like 2 minutes, and then you can tell me if I'm on the right track or not. Because here's what I think a lot is going on in some of the churches, and a lot of men are being taught that, you're the leader, which they are, but it's this idea of I'm the boss of you and I can tell you what to do anytime and you have to listen to me because that's just the way it is and that's just how it is. And when men do that to their wives, as a wife, with a husband who doesn't treat me like that, I literally think it destroys women and it destroys marriages. So here's my scenario. Someone called me one time and said, we're married. We go to this church. I do not like the church we're going to. I don't like the pastor. I don't trust him. I went to my husband and told my husband this. Thankfully, her husband was smart enough to be like, well, honey, let's go find another church then. He loved this church. She didn't. He didn't say, I'm the boss of you and you're going to listen to me. He did not do that. So they went and found another church. He goes back to the original church. And he goes to the leadership and says, I just want you to know that we're going to be leaving the church. And they said to him, you need to be a man. You need to go home. You need to be a leader to your wife. And you need to tell her absolutely not that you are staying at this church. Now, that unfortunately is what's going on out there. Now, I say that because this husband of this woman, he was great, and he loved his wife enough to care more for her than he did himself. He never thought he was the boss of her. For my own marriage with my husband, Rob, he always says this, Lisa, I don't worry about your verse about submission. I worry about my verse, which is Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wife, as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. So it's like when Rob loves me, it's sacrificial. It's like he cares more for me and what I think than what he cares about. And so what happens in our marriage is when a decision has to be made, 99% of the time, that's what I'm saying, if men are doing this with their wife right, us women, we win. Like hands down, it's the greatest marriage ever because he loves us and they care more for us. So 99% of the time he's like, Lisa, whatever you want to do, I'm fine with. Now, if there's that, 2% that I'm like, Rob, I think we should do this. And he's like, nope, I really, totally, really feel like the Lord's calling us to do this. Then that's when I get to step in and say, you know what, Rob, I respect you. I know that decision's hard to make because you love me so much that you care more for me. But if you are that adamant about that, then I am respecting you, going with you and going that. So, and I get that there has to be like a leader in a country or, even in a marriage. But I always say if men can learn how to love their wives sacrificially and not, I'm the boss of you and you have to listen to me, I think it changes a marriage. It changes a woman. She has no problem coming under his authority when they're treated like that. But if Rob bossed me around all the time, I would be miserable. So anyway, that's my thought. I always say if men need to learn how to love their wives sacrificially, and us women, we need to be careful and respect our husbands when they do have to make a difficult decision, because it is very hard. So right track, wrong track.
Love your response. And it pains me to hear that a woman does not feel comfortable and loved at a church. And the church's response is, man up, tell her what to do.
It's shocking.
It's disturbing, and that's a kind of abuse. I do believe Scripture teaches that there are certain roles for pastors in the church, certain roles for men in a marriage, but it's not a top-down power role, do what I say. What the church should have done is, wow, I'm really bothered that she doesn't feel loved and cared for here. Can we sit down together and ask some questions? What could we do better? How can we make you feel loved? Gosh, if she's feeling this way, I wonder if others feel this way. That's the kind of love and service and leadership that the Scripture teaches. Like you said, leading with love. So there's some verses in the Bible that if you take them out of context, biblical context, cultural context, can seem pretty disturbing. I mean, you take this verse in itself, Ephesians 5:24. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives submit in everything to their husbands. You take that out of context, and sadly, it's been used this way many times. Women listen to men. And by the way, it doesn't say women submit to men. It says wives submit to husband. That's an important distinction. And say, I have the authority, do what I say. Can I tell you, any pastor who does that, any husband who does it and uses the passage this way is going to have to give account to the Lord for abusing the Scriptures. There is an authority structure built into the family and built into the church. But the question is, like you said, what are the responsibilities and what is this authority supposed to look like? So right after it says, wives submitting everything to their husbands, it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So men are given the commandment, husbands are given the commandment, to love their wives. The next question is, what does it mean to love my wife? Does it mean to have the authority, tell her what to do because I'm the boss? That's the opposite of what it means. It means love her and give himself up for her as Christ did the church. And of course, the question is, how did Christ give himself up for the church? Well, Philippians 2 makes it very clear that although Christ was and is God, he humbled himself and laid aside certain rights and authority and power to lay down his life. The kind of leadership men are called to, husbands are called to in the marriage, is one of sacrifice, one of humility, one of following the example of Jesus, who when they tried to rush to make him king, he's like, nope, I'm going to go up alone and pray. The kind of leadership that says, yeah, I might be the leader of these disciples, but instead of telling you to wash my feet, I'm going to wash your feet. So yeah, there is an authority structure, I believe Scripture teaches, in the family, in the church. And women are called in this to submit to their husbands. But it's not a power move. It's not used to abuse the wife. And it grieves me when I hear stories like this. It is one of love. And what I found is I've talked with my wife about this. I'm like, do you think when a husband is really sacrificing and loving his wife in this fashion, does it come more easily and naturally for a woman to submit? She's like, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And by the way, last thing I'll say about this, we tend to look at this passage through 20th century modern egalitarian ethos if we go back to the culture at this time, what Paul was saying is radical. He's saying, men, you don't have unending power over your wives. You actually have to love her sacrificially. And the early church was flooded with women believing and finding liberation and sexual liberation in the church because they were eager for men to lead in the example of Jesus. So yes, the Bible teaches this. Now where it gets tricky and what we're going to get into today, so to speak, is what happens when the husband is not keeping up his end of the bargain. That's where it gets difficult. And that's where it gets tricky. And we're going to work through some of those nuances today. But in some men, you've got the responsibility to love sacrificially, to sanctify your wife and care about her spiritual development first. That's actually a pretty tall order that gives me fear as a husband to make sure I'm doing that. So I wish more men would read this. Instead of going, good, I've got the power, make me dinner, they go, oh my goodness, I'm humbled. God gave me this responsibility.
Yeah.
I better make sure I am loving my wife in the way that Jesus did.
Yeah. It terrifies my husband. He's like the greatest guy in the whole world. He just loves to, because he really cares about what God thinks about that. And so but as a woman, you can't imagine how much we hear the abuse that goes on. And it's just like, I don't know. I just want to reach these men. Now, on the offhand of that, we will, because the men here, they're getting ready to leave. They're like, I don't want to be here anymore. We will talk about, like, on the offhand of that, like, what if your wife is, last night, one of the questions is, what if your wife is a witch? And Mike Winger was like, do you mean like an actual witch? And I'm like, no, like just someone that's just not very nice. But so we will go down that road too with the women. So just so you know that. All right, question number 3. How do I divorce-proof my marriage? Because people get married and they need to know, like, you would laugh. Yesterday we came in here, we were setting everything up, and a girl came in and she was all excited because this is where they were going to have their wedding. And she was running around and she was so excited. And I'm thinking, oh, wow, you might want to run. You have a long road ahead of you, you know. But so going into it, like, how do I divorce-proof my marriage?
I'm not sure you ever 100% can. I know men who have loved their wives as far as I can tell, did everything right, and their wives disconnect, and vice versa. Now, I say that not to discourage you and think, oh, great, I'm at a marriage conference, I'm watching this video, and there's nothing I can do. No, what I'm saying is I think we should have a certain healthy fear that motivates us to never stop working on our marriage. 1 Peter 5:8 says, your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion. I probably get sucked into too many reels and videos on lions attacking their prey online. I'm like, oh, one more. Oh, no way. Oh, that's awesome. But you just watch the way a lion attacks. Peter used that intentionally. So if our marriages portray God's love to the church, then wouldn't we think that one of Satan's non-stop strategies would be to, in even the smallest way, try to divide us as husbands and wives and tear marriage apart? So never lose that healthy fear, so to speak. So what can we do to have a healthy marriage? I'd say a few things is spend time with couples who have healthy marriages. There's so much wisdom that can be gained from watching other couples who love each other, who care for each other, who are good parents. My dad grew up with really just as broken of a background as you can imagine. He was and is a wonderful dad. I'm like, Dad, how'd you learn how to be a good dad? He goes, I plagiarized. He goes, I didn't plagiarize my books, I'd get in trouble, but I plagiarized my parenting because I wanted to watch people. If you want to divorce-proof your marriage, spend time in particular with older couples who have gone together and learned big life lessons, and watch them. Ask them questions. Learn from them. Ask them, how did you divorce-proof your marriage? Another thing pretty simple is just work on your marriage. Never feel like you've arrived. my daughter is on a diet and she goes, how long do I have to do this until I'm dialed in? I said, honey, she's 15. You actually get to where you want to be, and then you never stop. The moment you go back, your body changes. It's a day-by-day decision. That's how it works. Same with marriage. So go on dates. For me, one of the things my wife and I love to do is we love to go on runs. We just love to run together, and we just talk and debrief the day. So there's a lot of times I don't feel like going on a run. As far as I can remember, I don't ever remember saying no. I'm sure she could remember at least one time where maybe I blew it and said no, but I try. We carve out dates together. We just positively work on our relationship. And the last thing I'd say is go to a marriage retreat, like Family Life. Folks in the family have marriage weekends. My wife and I have gone to these. You want a divorce-proof of marriage? They'll talk about everything. Finances, sex, parenting, and forces you to talk and work these through together. My wife and I did that early in our marriage and frequently point back to the things that we learned. So in sum, never let down your guard. Spend time with people who you think have healthy marriages, particularly those who are older. Never stop working on your marriage, and consider even going to a weekend marriage retreat. You would learn and be challenged in a ton of ways.
We were at church this weekend, and the pastor said something really interesting. He was talking about how you need to cut out certain things in your life that are destroying your life. One of the things he said was his wife would go out with a group of friends, and when she would come back home to him. The friends or his wife would be angry with him. And he'd be like, what just happened? Because she would go with this group of friends and they would all talk negatively about their spouses. And so by the time she's done with this, she's come home, now she's mad at him. And he said, finally she realized, I need to cut those friends out of my life. So I think a lot of it too is really be careful who you hang out with and be careful who you are getting your counsel from, I guess. So. Okay, let's go to number 4. What can I do if sex with my spouse is not fulfilling? We all look at the movies, we see all this whatever, and you're like, oh, that's how it should be. And then you get married and you're like, oh, I don't think that's really it. So,
I loved how you framed that with the example of looking at movies and then maybe not experiencing a certain way based on our expectations. Because I think that's the heart of it, is we have certain expectations, what are often called scripts, of ways we think sex is going to be. It doesn't meet our expectations, and so we're disappointed. It's interesting, in prepping for this, I talked through a ton of these with my wife, and she said to me, she goes, my guess is that this would probably tend to be more of an issue for women than it would be for men. That's somewhat of a generalization, but I think she's probably right. And she gave an example to me of a woman in a Bible study that she counseled who came to her and was like, I'm just not enjoying sex with my husband. And my wife's advice that I thought was so good is she said, one is you've got to mentally prepare yourself. Now, as a guy, I'm like, really? You have to mentally prepare yourself? I don't really feel like I got to mentally prepare myself. But that you laugh because you know there tends to be a difference, right? And my wife and I have had these conversations for years, just how there's a difference. And sometimes I've thought, why didn't God just wire us the same? Wouldn't it be easier? And he didn't, because he wants us to not think about ourselves and learn to love the other. That's actually when sex becomes the most fulfilling, when you're not thinking about yourself. So God wired men and women differently to figure out how to please and care for the other. There's something beautiful in that part of God's design. So her advice to a friend was, think through your expectations and try to have fitting expectations. And then second, communicate those to your spouse. You've got to talk about this because we all bring expectations without even realizing it. That's what makes this so difficult, is we have expectations that have been shaped by the culture, maybe shaped by our biological sex, maybe shaped by something we're not even aware of it. We bring it to the table and we're disappointed because someone's not meeting our expectations, yet we've never taken the time to communicate those expectations or start by asking our spouse, what are your expectations? When do you most enjoy sex? What could I change or do differently so this is more fulfilling to you? Those are the kinds of questions that I think we're called to ask one another. The last thing I'll say about this is sometimes we hear, I work with students a lot, and a question I'll get sometimes from young people is, well, if we don't have sex before we get married, how will we know if we're compatible? And my answer is, sex is downstream from compatibility. If you work on your relationship first, 99% plus of the time, the sexual fulfillment is going to take care of itself. Because one of the lies in our culture is that sex is just physical. But biblically, it's spiritual, it's emotional, it's relational. And so when somebody feels loved and they feel cared for, in the vast majority of circumstances, the sex takes care of itself. I said the last thing, but I did have one more thing to say, is I would encourage you to think through, if sex is not fulfilling, it could be that there's a deeper root issue that needs to be resolved in your life. This could be a range of things. It could be things like past hurt. It could be past abuse. It could be resentment. It could be disappointment. It could be viewing pornography and how that's shaping you. Proverbs 20 verse 5 says, a plan in the heart of a person is like deep water, but a person of understanding draws it out. So, in sum, all of us need to adjust our expectations, work on the relationship itself, but also, if there's a deeper root issue, be willing to prayerfully find out what that deeper issue is and deal with it. And then I think if you resolve that, you'll find that the sex takes care of itself.
Is that something they should go find a marriage counselor? Like, are you for marriage counseling if there's problems like this in their
one of two things? Just a wise person in your life who can give you perspective, typically somebody older, or yes, I'm in favor of marriage counseling. Now, when you say marriage counseling, that could mean a lot of things to different people, but go to church if they have counselors who have some training in marriage counseling. Absolutely, that would be the next step if you feel like you can't get there yourself.
Okay, perfect. All right, question number 5. What's the best way to be married to someone who is completely opposite than I am? The question says, everything he does annoys me and everything I do annoys him. So you get that.
So my wife and I are very similar on a lot of levels. We're both morning people. We're both introverts. We both like to exercise. Like, we have so many things that we have in common. But my sister and her husband, my wife and I laugh sometime, we're like, they could not be more polar opposites. Introvert, extrovert, outgoing, like detail person, big person. I mean, on almost every level, and yet they're compatible. And I think what makes it work for them is they found a way to turn their differences into strengths rather than weaknesses. Now, you might say that's easier said than done, but I think the only way you can make opposites work, if you're able to look at your differences, appreciate them for what they are, and begin to view them as strengths rather than weaknesses. Now, how does this happen? A lot of this is in communication. I believe the vast majority of issues in marriage and life comes back to communication and faulty expectations. Mm-hmm. Do you communicate? I mean, look, you get to choose your spouse, but you don't get to choose your kids, right? So I love my kids, but I would not have married somebody with the personality of my kids. It would be a lot harder to make it compatible. My wife and I chose each other, but you still got to choose to find a way to love them, right? Still got to choose to find a way to love them. So with my kids, we've got to communicate, hey, when you just throw your clothes in the middle of the hallway, do you know what that communicates to me? And actually, more importantly, do you know what that communicates to your mom? Do you know how that affects our household? Now, I'm not going to say my kids are always like, you're right, Dad, I'll change and never do it again. Doesn't work that way, but that's the conversation we consistently have because there's differences and we want to see them as strengths. So if because my wife and I have so much in common, we don't have to communicate on certain things. If you have an opposite, you're going to have to communicate. You're going to have to communicate a lot. It could be simple things like when you just leave the toothpaste out and don't put the cap on, it drives me nuts because I like things in their place. So I realize you leave it out not to do this to me. But is this something you could work on? Here's what it would mean to me. But also, instead of focusing on fixing what your spouse has to change, maybe ask yourself, what could I do differently that would communicate that I care about my spouse, and in doing the things to work on this relationship, lead by example. So in some, see your opposites as a strength, and the only way to do that is by communicating consistently a lot about this. The other thing I would say is, here's the last thing to think about. Is it really just not putting the cap on the toothpaste, or is there something deeper going on? Because I know it's not the same with a roommate, but I've had roommates that don't do little things, and sometimes it's just the little things that drive me nuts. Sometimes it's those little things that bring up all the other underlying issues that need to be addressed. And unless you address those, all the little changes are just window dressing, so to speak. They're just window dressing. So I would do what you can to find out if there's a deeper issue at play and then deal with it. Because the bottom line is, you know what? If you know somebody loves you and they're trying, and they do littler things, don't you have a much larger well of grace and understanding when you know their heart is there? So turn opposites into strengths if you can. Only happens by communicating, but make sure you take the time to see if there's something deeper going on. And if so, try to deal with it.
Yeah, that's great. Now, the other thing with Sean is that most of us, like, we met someone and then we got married in like 6 months, a year. Sean knew his wife since when?
Third grade.
He met her on what, the bus? Was it like love at first sight in the third grade?
No, actually, my friend Jessie asked me to sit by her and ask her if she thought he was cute. I have that memory in third grade. Bottom line, I married her, he didn't.
There you go. So he had a long time to get to know her. So, okay, let's go to number 6. So this is supposed to be like, this section is about Christian spouses. So what if my spouse is a believer, but he or she is just not very interested in spiritual things? Okay, they say they're Christians, but they don't really want to go to church. They don't want to talk about God. They don't want to,
So here's a difficult truth in life. We all know this. You can't make anybody do anything. Mm-hmm. You can't force your spouse to care about spiritual things. Can't force your kids to care about spiritual things. I mean, even the rich young ruler walked away from Jesus. And that's not encouragement to give up. That's a reality that God has given us this thing called free will. And we don't have control over other people. Now, my first encouragement is to lead by example. I know that's easier said than done, but focus first not on how do I get my spouse to care about spiritual things, but am I in the scriptures? Am I living my life caring about spiritual things? Am I living the life that Peter talks about in 1 Peter 3:15, that set yourself apart, focusing on Christ, and if somebody asks, be ready with an answer. Are you living a life that your spouse and your kids would find compelling and desirable for themselves? So rather than focusing first on getting my husband or wife concerned about spiritual things, maybe look within and get your life set first, because that's something we can control. The other thing I would say is be patient. You're in this marriage for the long haul, and God wants this marriage to work. So sometimes I'm in an Uber car, I'm driving a plane, and I realize the conversation turns spiritual. I'm like, I'm going to make the most of this, probably never see this person again. Yeah, that's not how it works in a marriage. So you should cultivate things with patience very, very differently. And at some point, I would say at the right way, at the right time, simply have a grace-filled conversation that says, I know you're a believer. From where I sit, you don't seem super interested in spiritual things. Can you tell me about that? And I would just begin the conversation by listening. I'm not here to judge. I love you no matter what. But as your spouse, can you give me some insight? I just want to understand. The Proverbs has a ton to say about listening and understanding and finding common ground. Some of the best advice my dad ever gave to me, he said, son, it's more important to understand than to be understood. What if you went to your spouse, rather than I'm trying to fix my spouse to make him more interested in spiritual things, you just say, from where I sit, we seem to have different levels of interest in spiritual things. Help me understand where you're at. All I want to do is understand. Is there anything I could do to encourage you in this fashion? If your spouse says, no, I'm not interested, then at least you learned where they're at. You can pray for them, and then maybe down the road revisit it. Or maybe they say, you know what, here's why I'm not interested, and you learn something. I think that also communicates to your spouse, I love you no matter what, I'm patient. Just do it at the right time, at the right way, at the right place, because that's a sensitive conversation.
You know, that's a really good point. My husband, with
I
the
was
kids,
wondering when you were going to say that. I've been trying for 40 minutes. I'm kidding.
For Rob, like he always would read his Bible in the morning, and the kids would always see that. And they even said when they came back to their faith in Christ, a lot of it was because they saw what their dad did. So even though you're thinking, why aren't our kids coming to Christ? But that was a big
That's
thing.
a really good point,
Yeah.
Lisa.
Okay, we have like 5 minutes. So let's do really quick. You know what? Let's nix number 7 because
Whatever you want.
there's a lot of questions. I think each one of the guys have
Okay.
a question about. It's this whole narcissistic thing. My husband or wife only cares about myself, whatever. So we'll deal with that. Let's go to 8. It's a parenting question. My husband and I are both Christians. I don't like how he disciplines our children. I think he's too harsh. He thinks I'm too easy. So.
Is it possible that your husband is wrong and he's being too harsh? Yeah, I'd say it's more than possible. It's probably most likely. If this is a mom sense, probably that's the case. Is it possible that he's right and you're wrong? It's possible. I can't answer that definitively because I don't know the nature of your relationship. I just push back because this can go both ways. Now, my guess is in most circumstances, probably 90+% of the time, it's the husband being too harsh than it is the mom. But I throw that out there because when I read a lot of these questions, rather than fixing my spouse, I try to read it through the lens of like, what do I need to change first? Well, with that said, what concerns me more about this is less the exact way you're dealing with disciplining your kids, but that you can't find common ground together. That's actually the deeper concern for me. Because if my wife came to me and said, you're too harsh, you're too this, that would give me pause. And I'm telling you, I might not feel like it in the moment, but I know I would listen and commit to it and hear her out because I value her wisdom. So for me, I wonder if this question is something deeper that's going on where there's a disconnect. And if you get that resolved and listen to each other better, I think you may be able to figure out some of the particulars of discipline. Other thing to keep in mind is we typically parent and discipline out of 2 things. Number 1, how we were parented and disciplined. And second, out of our hurt. A lot of fathers discipline out of hurt because they have been hurt. As Rick Warren said, hurt people hurt people. And sadly, the power disparity with parents and with kids couldn't be greater. You have all the power. And my son's graduating from high school, so at that moment, it makes you rethink a lot of things. And I'll be honest with you, I don't have a lot of really any regrets about parenting my son, if I'm going to be honest with you. But I look back certain times, I'm like, yeah, I had to apologize for this and apologize for that and adjust this and adjust that. I was reacting out of my own failures, my own insecurities, my own hurts. And so I wonder if your husband is being too harsh, if he's just acting out the model that he saw, and if there's deeper hurt. So my encouragement on this one would be to talk to a counselor who can objectively walk through what's too harsh, what's not too harsh, what's too soft, and give you some objective analysis of where those boundaries can and should be. Start there and approach it that way with your husband. I think you can make some progress.
You know, you said something really interesting because the whole apology thing. I think a lot of people don't realize how important it is to apologize to our kids. When we do something really, like if we're mean to them or we're angry with them, to go back and apologize. And my husband has always done that, and I appreciate to hear you say that, because a lot of people don't realize, they think we're the authority, we should never apologize, but I don't think that's true.
The authority should apologize more. Exactly. You have a greater responsibility.
Right, exactly. Okay, you can answer this really quick. My spouse likes to work and be away from home. How can I get him to care more about our home and family than work?
You can't force your spouse to care more about family than work.
It's a communication
problem. You can't force anything. I would encourage you a few things. Number one, pray, assuming this is the husband typically, although it could be the wife at times. Pray for him or her, their heart and opportunities. I would encourage you to positively encourage your spouse when they spend time with the kids and spend time with you. Not in a passive, aggressive, manipulative kind of way, genuine appreciation. Hey, you picked up the kids from school today. I know you didn't get work done, but Johnny loves every moment he has with you. Hey, thanks for going to practice early and just watching and bringing the kids home. Thanks, whatever it is, genuinely, because there's one of the reasons I think men can become workaholics is they're finding their identity and getting affirmation from work. God has wired us. I mean, I can't explain it, but when my wife is like, I'm proud of you, you're awesome, I'm like, yeah, like it's just like, that's why the end of Spider-Man 2, when he's like, go get him, Tiger, I'm like, yes, you can do anything with your wife by your side. Find ways to affirm your husband for who he is and the positive difference that he makes on the kids. Try positive encouragement instead of nagging. I'm not assuming all of you do that, but if you do, I'm telling you, it doesn't work. The other thing I would say, in the right time and the right way, maybe have a conversation and just say, honey, I love you. Can I give you some perspective as a mom? Have you thought about your life in 10 years? Have you thought about your life in 20 years? How your kids are going to look back at the availability or non-availability of your dad? Mm-hmm. How do you think they will view things from that lens? And let it sit. You can't force your husband to care, but you can pray, you can model, you can encourage, and you can ask the right questions.